Okay, hello everybody, good morning. Most of you know me by now. My name is Will. I haven't really been involved in the last few weeks of this course because Scott and John have been excellently taking you through those themes. But this week, Jane asked me to pre-record a short presentation on our experiences to date in organizing the workshop at the site of Kilwa Kisiwani in Tanzania. Now, as you will be aware, this is one of two workshops that are being run as part of this CVI-Africa project. And I suppose I want to start by saying that this is very much a work in progress. This grant that we are running, which this training is a part of and these workshops are a part of, is being run over a very short period of time. We have just a year and a very limited amount of resources to do it in. And so this process is ongoing, and the situation we find ourselves in, both due to COVID and other factors, are causing us and necessitating us to respond in different ways. Which are all really good to think about CVI and to think about how we run these kind of assessments at the site. So what I want to take you through today is not the solution. In a sense, it is the process that we are actively developing, the reasons why we are making certain choices and suggestions in the run-up and the organization of this workshop. Before I do that, I think it's a good idea just to take you through what a normal workshop looks like. And I put normal in inverted commas here, because this is a technique that's very much evolved over the last few years, and we're fast encountering a situation where there is no normal anymore. And that workshops have had to adapt and change depending on their environments, both due to COVID and due to local factors. What I then want to do is present to you what some of the aims of this project were, and the goals and how they link into what's happening with COVID and perhaps the interplay between the two. And then I want to get stuck into this question of some of the particular challenges at organizing the workshop at Kilwa, some of the risks and some of the solutions which we're talking about. And all these are really building up to this workshop, which we very much hope some of you will be involved in, that will be happening on the site of Kilwa Kisiwani, but almost certainly not at the site of Kilwa Kisiwani in October 2021. So this CVI Africa project was very much focused for the first 6 to 7 months on the training course, the course that you have all been a part of. And we're now kind of moving into the secondary stage, which is the application of this technique to these sites, Kilwa being one of them. Jane and Ishinlosen, who you've met, are in charge of looking over the and preparing for the second workshop, which is happening in Sukur. So I'm really speaking on behalf of myself, Mercy and Bugumba from Tawa and the National Museums in Tanzania. So what does the CVI workshop look like in normal times? When really the best people to talk about this are Scott and John. They have led and facilitated every workshop to date based on the CVI technique, and have been forced to adapt many of these in light of recent things that have been happening here. But their role really emphasizes one of the key parts of the CVI process, which is that it is a process. So there are certain steps that need to be adhered to, and the themes of what you've been exploring in the last few weeks very much relate to these processes and these steps, but also that it's facilitated. And that means that it is run and it is led by somebody who is familiar with the technique. So it's quite formulaic. It involves the collection of certain types of data, the exploration of certain key values, and a summation of impacts on those values. Usually the workshop is organized by a steering committee, and this steering committee meets regularly prior to the workshop. They would usually start meeting 4 or 5 months prior to the workshop date, and then meet with increasing frequency in the build-up to the workshop. And the role of that steering committee is both to identify key stakeholders and establish the ways and the means of getting people involved, but also to organize the practical aspects of the workshop. And that, of course, can change drastically depending on factors like the situation we're in at the moment. And it's many of these questions and these challenges which we're currently actually dealing with. The CVI process usually takes quite a lot of time and input from a wide range of people from different sectors. So obviously probably the most time comes from the facilitators, people like Scott John, or workshop organizers, people like myself, Jane, Bagumba, Mercy, Ishan Lozen. It takes quite a lot of time and engagement. And I think perhaps in the CVI Africa project, one of the things that we did not account for enough was how much free time and how able people were within their professional capacities to really commit that level of time. And I think we've had to think on our feet and come up with some solutions to respond to that, which I will touch on in relation to the Kilwa workshop. Normally, workshops happens on or near sites. They have traditionally been in person and would involve a group of international, national and local stakeholders meeting for anywhere between 3 and 5 days. Now, just to give you an example of what this might look like, this image on the right here, I believe is the Wadden Sea workshop. I was not there. This image is dated as being February 2020. Obviously, a lot changed in the world between February 2020 and February 2021, when the next stage of the workshop happened. And this required a change in the format of this workshop that everybody moved online. So this image is taken from February 2021 from the CVI workshop in the Wadden Sea. And you can see here the situation where basically the same stakeholders were all involved, but they were all joining from their own homes over internet using a Zoom format, and that is a process that worked at the Wadden Sea and worked especially well at the recent CVI workshop they had in Edinburgh, but is incredibly reliant on people having strong and decent internet connectivity in order to be able to do that. And that certainly is not something that we can rely on all over the world, or even in all parts of countries anywhere in the world. In Ireland, where I'm from, our cities have excellent broadband and internet, and our rural areas can be shockingly poor, in some cases still relying on dial-up broadband, which would make something like this impossible. But I think it is important to note at this point, and we'll come back to this when we think about what the overall aims of the CVI Africa project were, is that a number of these things which make the CVI process and what it's evolved into necessary, including strong internet connectivity, travel of international experts, and this issue of expertise availability and whether people have the time to engage in this process. That while COVID has exemplified and exaggerated a number of those issues, they are not issues unique to COVID. So the process we've had to go through and are going through and will be going through for these workshops are actually all valuable exercises, whether or not we live within a COVID world or we don't. Because certainly bringing stakeholders from all over the world can be expensive. And if this is a process that we want to be able to be applied across the board at World Heritage sites and other sites, it needs to be a process that states parties and sites are able to run. So we need to be able to work out a way around some of these challenges anyway. So what were the CVI Africa project goals and deliverables? Now I include in here this graph on the right, which is from an article by John, which shows the CVI spectrum and potential mitigation options. Now, we wrote the application for CVI Africa in April-May 2020. So at the time, the impact of COVID was being considered, but perhaps the scale of its impact had not been fully realized by funding bodies. But we were asked to increase a small section on COVID mitigation within our application, just to show that we had thought about it. Now, I would be lying to you if I didn't say that at this time, most of us believed that by the time we got around to the workshops, we would have been through the worst of the pandemic. I think we had very much envisioned, all of us, trainees and participants and stakeholders and experts alike, being able to sit around together at one of these sites and chat through our experiences of this process. Now it's becoming increasingly clear that that is not going to be possible. So this COVID mitigation was actually a very, very good process. But I think key to this was the language we used in our application for this project, where our first objective, and as such it was our primary objective, was to work with local partners and stakeholders to pilot and assess, keyword there, assess the utility of the CVI at 2 African World Heritage properties. And I've abridged that slightly just to fit it onto the slide. So a part of what we're doing here is about the process rather than the result. I think everybody is very confident in our ability to complete this project and to undertake workshops at both these sites, but it's actually in the outworking of how we're going to do this and how we're going to react to the challenges and problem solve and come up with solutions, which is where the real, as we say in Ireland, meat and potatoes or the substance of this project lies. Now, that is not to undermine the importance of these workshops. They are incredibly important. But I think sometimes when being repeatedly encountering challenges and problems, it's quite easy to get disheartened. And I think that we've always been keen in this project to come back to this idea that it is in the solving of problems and the coming up with solutions that we are delivering this project. I think that's important. Our COVID mitigation then within the application was to stress that a large part of this course, including the training, which you guys are going through and are coming to the end of, but also a lot of the preparatory steps for these workshops can happen remotely anyway, so they can be done online. And so in this case, 7 out of our 10 working packages were already planned to be conducted remotely. Right, and this meant that the project could still achieve most of its objectives. Now, it should be noted that we're now facing a truism that probably 9.5 of the work packages are having to be run remotely, and the 0.5 will become clear in a little bit. So as a contingency level, we went back to the CVI spectrum and said, in an ideal world, what we want to do is this gold model where everybody's together. We have this massive group of people sitting around the table, like we saw in the previous slide. And over 2 to 3 days, we're able to have these really dynamic and exciting conversations and breakouts and take apart the CVI process and identify the key parameters. And that's just not going to be possible in the way that we thought it was. So as part of our COVID mitigation strategy was to suggest this idea of a CVI consult model, which is a more rapid process, which involves a smaller workshop with key stakeholders representing different groups that would happen over a smaller period. But even this CVI consult model actually wasn't really thought about in terms of COVID, right? And so what we've done is we've taken this and we've adapted it and we've thought of ways to improve some aspects of it and some of the things that we're going to lose, and we've thought of ways about how we can kind of find those things again. So key to this, when we go back to base principles, is what were the acceptable impacts to these workshops based on our application. And these were that it was acceptable that, given the fact that international experts or even maybe national or regional experts would not be able to travel, that we would have reduced participation within our workshop. So rather than that big group of people, our workshops are likely, and it's perfectly fine for them to be smaller. The idea was that they can be in person or partially in person, but can also have fairly substantial remote components. So if we think back to that key part of the CVI process, that it is a facilitated process, that this is a process that in this project will be led by Scott and or John, that they will need to be able to join in and to lead this process, to facilitate this process. So certainly that aspect of it is going to have to be remote, as actually will the engagement of an awful lot of other regional expertise, and maybe even in some cases national expertise, depending on lockdowns and restrictions. It is possible to change and play around with the number of days which people meet. This is really just a reflection of the fact that if we have people joining from the USA and Australia, and we're running workshops on the continent of Africa, and we have to be aware of the fact that our days are going to be shorter. We might only have 4 or 5 days to work together. So it might be that we run a shorter, smaller workshop over 1 or 2 days, or we expand it out to 5 or 6 days, depending on what works within that situation. And unfortunately, but necessarily, we also had to accept that the depth of our analysis would be more limited, that it would almost certainly be preferable for us all to be in that big room together chatting about these things. If that is not possible, we have to come up with other ways of doing this. And that is going to mean that the depth of our analysis is going to be limited, or that the focus of our analysis might have to change slightly, or the way in which we collect data might have to change slightly. So just kind of in the summary box here, it was felt that whereas we could accept a lot of these impacts, it was really strongly felt that by working with in-country partners, we could achieve more than just this. We could achieve a kind of hybrid. And the word and terminology we have been using isn't this silver model, which we see here, the CVI consult. It was this idea of a silver plus model designed specifically for each of the workshops. And this is probably a very good time to emphasize that with the solution for Kilwa is very different from our solution from Sukur. These are two totally different countries in two totally different situations, facing totally different challenges, and therefore it's necessary to come up with solutions for both workshops. But I'm really only able to speak to the decisions we have been making for Kilwa. So when it became clear, really back in March, April, that international travel was not going to be possible, that it might not even be possible to have any substantial internal travel at either workshops. If you think back to March, April, it really was kind of one of the worst times in this global pandemic. We decided to do a kind of risk analysis. And what we did was to identify the key risks and then try and give a level as to how likely these risks might be. So the first risk was that the CVI assessment cannot happen at all. Now, we all felt that the chances of this happening were really quite low. One way or another, we would do the CVI. It might be that we had to accept certain impacts, but it was going to be possible to do a CVI. We were all keen to make it as productive as possible. So it was deemed the risk of this not happening at all really as being quite low. The idea that the workshops cannot happen at all was deemed as being a medium risk. And this was because it was and remains quite possible that given the spread of COVID and the way variants are working, that even if we planned a workshop, it might not actually be able to go ahead. If, for example, there are national lockdowns or restrictions on people meeting in groups outside their families, it might not be possible for workshops to happen. So we had to accept that this was a possibility. Within that then was the possibility that workshops might have to happen off-site and some stakeholders cannot attend. And the risk of this was deemed to be high, and that's probably now evolved into certain, that it's not going to be possible to have all stakeholders attend workshops. And it is now highly likely in both cases that the workshop's going to have happen off-site, so away from site. And this is because of the fourth point here, which is the internet connection. In a case where stakeholders cannot attend in person, internet connection is very important. And poor internet connection would make engagement difficult, or could, in theory, if it didn't exist, make it impossible. Okay? So we had to accept that if we were going to not meet together, and if we had to get people together, we also had to factor in the risk of there not being strong enough internet to enable people to join. Another risk was the idea that workshop participants or stakeholders do not reflect the necessary expertise. Now, a mistake that we made in planning for this project, and I think it's always good to be very honest about the mistakes we made, was that we hugely undervalued monetarily the requirements of partners and stakeholders to get involved in a process like this. And I'll explain that a little bit now. In the UK, where I am, Europe, North America, parts of Australia, people within the heritage sector are often facilitated and encouraged and paid for by their governments to engage in processes like this. That's not the case in the majority of the world. And it quickly became clear to us that if we wanted the engagement of the best people, then we were going to have to very rightly and correctly ensure that they were properly recompensed for their engagement, because many of them were engaging after a long day's work or doing the work on weekends. And so initially back in March, April, before we came up to a solution, this idea of not having the best people involved actually emerged as quite a significant threat. And that would undermine the whole CVI process. A couple of other factors here. I won't go through them all. But again, a lot of them engaged with engagement, levels of engagement, and what have you. But I think I've highlighted the key ones there within the context of Kilwa. So in order to problem solve this, we wanted to go right the way back to what the process was for the CVI, right? Within the CVI Silver, or what we're going to call Silver Plus process, the workshop itself, which is the physical meeting of key people, is limited to a small group of maybe 7 or 8 people. And this might include this world's site manager, the facilitators, other key people associated with the site or associated with heritage and within those countries. And those people were going to have to bring together and make the judgments normally taken in a much larger workshop. But in order to do that, they were going to have the information necessary, which had to come from experts who weren't going to be able to take part in this process. So, for example, there is no climate scientist involved in this smaller workshop model. But that meant that we couldn't have the workshop without that input. So we had to work out a way to get that input separate from the workshop. Similarly, with things like heritage expertise, it will not be possible to have experts on all the many complex areas of value and outstanding universal value of the World Heritage Site present at that workshop. So we have to try and work out a way to collect that information prior to the workshop so that it can be discussed by that core group of people. And similarly then with the socio and economic factors. And even with these experts then, we need to have other people feeding into this. So socioeconomic expertise needs to be fed into from the local community, from the local economy, and heritage expertise. There's going to have to be some input there from national advisory bodies, perhaps people involved in the monitoring of the site at Kilwa. So what was our response to this? Well, the responses to the workshops were as follows: to collect as much data as possible before the workshops via online webinars, and we've set dates for these, and we're about to send out letters to key representatives who can speak at these webinars. And Mercy and Bagumba and myself have worked very hard in identifying who these key people would be. Central to this is that we increase our funding for the engagement of these representatives. So people who speak at these webinars will be offered professional fees for the day to do that, and they will be required for those fees to produce both a presentation and a short report. And that presentation at these webinars will be to that core steering group committee who will be there as part of the Silver Workshop. The risk to the internet issues then, it was decided, and this was not an easy decision, that it was necessary to move the workshop from the site at Kilwa, where the internet strength was quite weak, to Dar es Salaam, and we're currently working out what venue that's going to be. And this will just ensure that everybody will be able to access this, including the facilitators, Scott and John, myself from the UK will be able to take part in this. Also for the webinars, because people, the expertise and stakeholders will be feeding in from different places, it's felt that we should allow the pre-recording of these videos so that if people cannot be assured of good internet connection, they can at least share videos with us prior to this, along with a short report, just in case the presentation is unclear. The issues to do with expertise and engagement, well, this is where actually there was a slight silver lining to COVID, because we had put quite a lot of money, for example, into international travel, into flying people all over the world to take part in these workshops. And that's no longer possible. So we were able to take money from that pot and put it in a new pot to say that we will use this to pay professional fees and honoraria to enable participation. And we're very much hoping that this means that we'll be able to get engagement from a wide group of people, and our risk of missing key people will be greatly reduced. One of the factors on the previous slide I didn't go into was the worry that we might be duplicating material. So for example, your week 2 content on climate science, a lot of the regional and global parts of those presentations will be reused in the webinar and then subsequently at the workshop itself, because that is information of use and of value to that key core group, that steering committee group as well. So what does this look like for Kilwa then? And I want to stress this is a tentative timetable. The nature of things changing, of people's busy lives, is that we're having to respond quite quickly to these things. But what we plan to have at Kilwa is a CVI consult workshop. So that is that key group of 7 to 8 people, which will happen in Dar es Salaam and will take place for 2 days, acknowledging the time differences of stakeholders joining from around the world at some time in the week commencing the 18th of October. It will include key representatives, including Mercy and Bagumba, also the acting head of Heritage from the Tanzania Authority on Wildlife and the National Museum, and 2 representatives from the local community, so the chairman of the Ruins Committee and a separate community member, and myself joining remotely. And it will be facilitated by Scott and John, and it will be preceded, so that's happening kind of mid to late October, by these 3 webinars which we just spoke about, which will happen hopefully on the dates being put out here. And you are all very welcome to attend those, and indeed over the next few weeks we will be discussing and establishing what the level of engagement from you, the participants in training, is going to be in this. But I think it's very much envisioned that 3 of you will kind of shadow this process at one, and 3 will shadow at the other in order to be involved. But if you look through the list of speakers on this, these are speakers who have been identified. Mercy and Bagumba primarily have suggested these people, and they feed in their expertise, feed into different themes. So the first one being on climate change, where we have climate scientists feeding into this and conservation specialists, then heritage, and so key people who understand the archaeology and the heritage values of the property, and then also some key people working within tourism and other aspects to feed into the socio-economic aspects of this. So all this information will then feed into this 2-day meeting, consult workshop, which will happen in Dar es Salaam in kind of October time. So then what next? Well, I've included this rather quote from roads were made for journeys, not destinations. I actually like this because these trees are near to where I live in Northern Ireland. But I think it makes the point that hopefully which has come across here, which is I am not presenting the results for anything here. I am presenting a process where decisions are ongoing and being made, where we are trying to respond to very challenging situations to ensure that we remain inclusive and that voices are heard. And there is a very good chance that by the time we come around to the workshops, a lot of these things will have changed again. And that kind of reflexive and the need to be malleable and understanding change is a key part of this process. Key to this is the idea that challenges provide both opportunities and solutions. And like I said, I used this little "we need you" here because we're very much in hoping that we're going to be able to work out how you guys fit into this process. We certainly want you to be involved, but we're trying to work out how we can maximize the learning experiences for all of us, and particularly you guys, in this process going forward. So hopefully I will be with you on Thursday and I'll be able to answer any questions which you have. But if I can't be, I hope that's given you a good overview of what we're trying to do at Kilwa, and as a kind of preparation for the next step of what's happening within the CVI Africa project. So thank you very much.